So great. So welcome everybody to this, well, I don't know how many is webinar in our Transpath Plan Project webinar series for learning and exchange. Today we have Joel Onyango from Kenya, and who's going to share with us his learnings and vision on decoloniality in convivial transformation practice. And with that being said, I give the floor to you, Joel, and also with a question, do you have the ability to share your screen? And if so, please do. If not, maybe Leon, can you make him a presenter?
Hi.
Yes, there it is.
You can hear me and see my screen as well.
Well, yes, we can hear you well. We can see your screen very well, and we see that you are already giving a task to us. So I'm going to grab my telephone also from the other side of my desk to enable me to join in yourmenti.com. But please, Joel.
Thank you very much, and welcome to this conversation. On behalf of the Kenyan Node, we thought we'd have a conversation about decoloniality and conviviality as it applies to transformation in different regards. So before we go into the talk that we have prepared, I wanted just to have a quick reflection from everybody on what comes to mind when we hear about this topic on conviviality and decoloniality. Maybe how it applies in your area of work, how it applies to the different spaces in which you are involved in. But generally, through Menti, you can see the code at the top of the screen, and you could just share your general thoughts about what comes to mind when you hear about decoloniality and conviviality. The Menti code is 56733022. And I'll just give 2 minutes for people to interact with this. If you go to menti.com, I enter the code, you should probably start seeing some responses coming on. And as you're doing that, just introduce myself briefly. My name is Joel. I work with the African Center for Technology Studies with a focus on climate resilient economies. And a lot of the times is about engaging with the community, engaging with stakeholders, and pushing towards differentiation of thoughts. Up to a couple of years ago, there was quite some interest from the team at ACT of the Climate Resilient Economies Program to influence change in how research is done. And in so doing, we got into this space when you're thinking about decoloniality. And in that space, we started reflecting on, what does it mean to do research in a way that is different, in a way that allows for more voices to come in. And we ended up, reflecting very broadly about decoloniality. We have so far been able to convene discussions, a lot of webinar sessions. We've discussed on aspects of decoloniality and conviviality. We've also hosted some summer schools in the part of Milani when we talked about this particular topic, and we try to see if we can practice it. For sure, it's not one of those easy to practice ideas, but I see already some responses are coming in from at least 3 people, and saying decoloniality and conviviality means living together, inequality, pathways, empathy, listening, co-designing the future, aspects of path dependency, acknowledging the past, moving towards equal partnership. Yeah, I think this is quite a good start, because, and now I'll just very quickly switch, even as the responses continue coming in. I'll switch to some slides that we prepared in trying to get to this topic. And I suppose we'll start seeing resonance between what we are sharing and what we have learned so far. So in our presentation is about things that we've learned as we go along this. And ideally, when we started reflecting on this decoloniality bit, the first thing was that decoloniality for us ended up being this space where we can reflect in plural pathways, plural ideas. So being able to value diversity and approaches that we can apply in a diverse way. So opening up the space for people to think about their own approaches, their own application of different ideas, opening that space. But of course, opening that space does not come easy. Now and then you have to challenge the dominant idea of doing things. And I think we did some of this work with the team from Latin America. And one of the things that catchphrases or the methodological rebellion, you need to be able to have some level of active scholarly activism, not just saying, well, we're talking about decoloniality and we've documented it and then that's it. How do you document it in a way that provokes change? So being an activist in how you publish, how you write your things, the spaces you offer for aspects of publishing and scholarship issues. And of course, this doesn't go without remembering that we all come from different backgrounds. You know, when you're in social science, in natural science, these philosophical aspects that you learn along the way, and being able to get out of it in terms of the philosophical drive is very different. And therefore, being aware of these parallels between what you are doing, what other people are doing, in some way of opening up the conversation about plurality and diversity of thought. Along the way, we also realize that you can't think about, looking at research and application in sort of a controlled way. And this is where conviviality starts coming in. It's never about control and being able to push, this is the only way of doing things. It's often the perception and the room for you to open up multiple pathways. That yes, this is the direction you want to go to, but we can achieve that using different pathways. It's not only one way of doing it, and therefore multidimensionality of different approaches that can be applied comes to play. And one of the fundamental things that bridges this gap about decoloniality and conviviality is about context. Often we go into research work with an idea that this could be a problem, but it might not necessarily be a problem to the people who it seems like it's a problem for. For instance, there's this question about cook stoves in Africa, cook stoves in Kenya. And along the way, there are people who are, coming up with technology to solve low emission development. And therefore they said, well, we need to have clean cook stoves. Clean cook stoves look like this. They demonstrated, they showed some, construction. A lot of the families went into it. The idea was it reduces emission, it makes it less likely to have indoor air pollution. But in the long run, this technology, the cook stoves, some of them were abandoned and they were being used for something totally different because they did not fit the cultural context of wanting to have a room that is warm, wanting to have a room that has some level of heat, so that even when you're cooking, there's that social space for, you're in front of fire, you're cooking, and you're also engaging in different cultural conversations. So this aspect of context and opening up spaces for multiple pathways, reflecting on the fact that there are different places where people come from, and importantly, using your scholarship as a researcher to pursue and actively challenge what is, then bridges us to what we could call conviviality, because conviviality is this tricky space between control and care. You want to be able to control because in any kind of research, in any kind of pursuit in terms of clear indication of research, there's always this way of doing things, and every discipline has a very clear way of doing things. That's the control factor. But then we want to embed the aspect of care. We want to be able to say, well, we are doing this, this is the way it happens, but how are we then opening up space for other ideas to come up? How is it readily available for the things, that the products you're having, the research you're having? How is it readily available? Who is using it? How often is this being used? This aspect of we have paper, we have a publication, but the level of which it can be understood is very low and is only for an elite group, then opens up space of how do you balance control and care? How do you build convivial perspectives? And this is the nexus in which, we thought we could have this conversation, that conviviality versus decoloniality in a world where we are thinking about transforming, we're thinking about leaving one step and going to the next. That aspect of transformation is very critical. And therefore, we are making a reflection that even when you're thinking about this conceptualization of a way that is ideally channeled to do specific things, there are specific hierarchies that you need to think about. And these hierarchies and racialized hierarchies often result to inequalities, and in the reflection on the Menti, there are already ideas about hierarchies, this space in which it doesn't allow us to live together in a communal way. So going towards conviviality allows us to think about how we can live together based on different distribution of economic power, distribution of resources, and therefore some level of social justice. And this is, the tipping point when you're thinking about research. When you think about, and you're thinking about implementation, you think about things that, yes, we open up space for people to express themselves, but we have a level of humility, we are humble, and we're able to ingrain what really is in the nexus of the community you're working with. And in generally, then we reflect on 5 ways that this could actually work. And one of the things is that in the middle of this is being able to recognize that, there's crucial knowledge. This needs to be able to address not just the current injustice or the current aspects, but also the past. And this, looking backward to say that, well, if you're going to look at the decoloniality in the aspects of in conviviality space, we need to recognize and address these aspects that we consider historical injustices, historical legacy issues of colonialism. And this one of the aspects that is very big, for example, in Kenya, and we're also experiencing already in our project in Western Kenya is about land ownership. The fact that if land ownership aspects is embedded in how it has always been in a colonial system, for example, and continuously pursuing that, then there are people who are going to be continuously marginalized. And as there is more marginalization, it means there's no equality, there's no equity, there's no chance that the power structures can actually be transformed. So we are saying, if you're thinking about decolonized, convivial transformation research, you need to think about, critically how the knowledge you have addresses the lasting impacts of colonialism, especially in the social, economic, and cultural systems, before you embed yourself into different perspectives of decoloniality. The second thing that also comes to mind is about being able to embrace this diversity. There's often a conversation, and today we are joking with some of our colleagues at ACT, that when you say the word Western knowledge, this is subtle. Western is always capitalized by virtue of how an English word that requires it to be capitalized. And people are learning about different months, the days of the week, names that need to be capitalized. But the word like indigenous is often not capitalized. So is it that it's an English word that doesn't get the same power in its own wording? But what you're saying is that as you embrace this diversity of knowledge, you also need to embed perspectives of indigenous wisdom. And you're giving an example here of sustainable agricultural transformation system. Sustainable agriculture, there's always this, ideas of doing sustainable agriculture that is very Western. How do we embed traditional wisdom, traditional indigenous farming practices that enhance this resilience in a way that is also acceptable for the cultural space? So ideally, we are thinking about being able to recognize and value diverse knowledge systems and also ways of passing this knowledge to other people. The third thing that we also learn is being able to redistribute resources that can be used for challenging inequality. So we can't talk about this space without confronting the social economic inequalities that are associated with colonial legacies. So how are we doing in terms of challenging dominant curricula or promoting inclusive pedagogy? So really looking back and saying this practice of how we are passing information does not fit our current context, and therefore we need to change it a particular way that fits our context. Are we able to learn from, specific disparities or areas of marginalization that we can reflect on? The fourth perspective is about economics. So economic systems are basically, in many ways, I want to use the word Eurocentric, and it has this way of doing things that is very dominant to, without room for alternative models in many cases. You could talk about different, guarantees of payment and all that. That is very, very largely controlled from a Western perspective. So how do you challenge these economic systems? One of the ways this is happening is about community-led activities. Within the Kenyan node, of course, and also within the project, there's this continuous push for community-led initiatives, community-led action, so that we have ownership, and that ownership very quickly promotes innovation and therefore alternative models of doing things. And finally, of course, the perspective of deconstructing Eurocentrism doesn't necessarily mean that everything is thrown away. The issue here is, how do we contextualize this kind of information? How do we make it inclusive in a context that can actually help us and help the different diversities of ideas and approaches to be more and readily acceptable within different contexts that you're working towards. So looking at all this, I mean, it's quite resourceful to also say we are talking about this contextualization, you're talking about acknowledgement, you're talking about embracing different perspectives, challenging dominant ideas. But why is it necessary for us to do this? From one perspective, you can start thinking about there's a lot of global policy and global policy research towards sustainability and therefore transformation and transitions that are almost like a vision. It's almost like this is the way of doing things. And we could describe this for many reasons. You can look at it from a singular vision. There's a specific hierarchy, and it's often quite calculated in some regard. It's almost like in a cockpit, and you're switching lights on and off, you're switching switches on and off just to make ideas and decisions to go a specific way. It's like thinking of a highway, this is the only way of doing this kind of thing. This is the only idea. We are challenging this as perspective, in terms of why it's important for us to reflect on conviviality and decoloniality, because we think that broadly, there has to be a thought about alternatives. Instead of thinking about this hubris nature in which we look at what is known and therefore what is not known is put aside, there's an approach to humility. There's a space for us to hope instead of instilling fear of a perspective of a possibility that is not or not known. There's a space for us to actually care instead of pushing for control as a way of enhancing realization as to what will actually be of use in the space of decoloniality and conviviality. And therefore, instead of pushing for this is how we grow, it's about how do we flourish together? How do we move towards a community, community sort of centric idea that is more precautionary and calculating against people who are vulnerable in the society. We can continue this conversation on, and I just wanted to have a reflection that within the Kenyan Node ecosystem, trying to look at some of the actions that we've done, is that we are seeing a community-driven approach. We are seeing a community-driven but scientifically facilitated. We are collecting information that enhances the position of the community rather than the other way around. And you're looking at this space for collective realization. You'll hear a lot of stories in some of the work we do that, someone walked into the workshops, we had a conversation with them. At the end, there was that aha moment, a self-realization, and therefore collective as well, into the things that people are doing and the things people could do differently. We are bringing in different agencies, we are bringing from a community perspective, their capacity to create change, from government perspective, their capacity to create change, and putting them together is a way of promoting some level of what we could call cross-agency humility, that there is room for me to work together. In some sense, we see a lot of aspects when you're trying to practice some of these things, that the realization that whatever happens, there's mutual benefits, or it could also be translated into a mutual curse if we don't do what we are supposed to do very well. And what we are emphasizing here is the fact that we are seeing continuously there's a space for care. That people walk into a meeting as if they don't know each other, and they leave shaking hands and reflecting in a way that it's really transformation within their own systems, their own way of doing things. And therefore, there's a space for care over control, and therefore space for alternatives of hybrid nature. And I don't know if at this point there are any questions, but just wanted to put a question out there, whether you agree in this space or you are against, and perhaps why you agree or you're against. But this is a place I'd be happy to take questions or comments about the presentation. Yep.
So is there anybody who wants to question or respond to what Joel mentioned? And indeed, maybe look. Now, yeah, let me take my own perspective, and I agree with your statement and what you have said, and that is, especially because I think if we think about transformations, we really think about a change in a certain status quo, and the status quo is always maintained in these systems due to a certain power status quo, and a transformation requires to overcome such, and therefore, and particularly, this thinking about decolonization, but definitely also in conviviality, to do it with empathy, to do it together, I think is very important. So thank you, Joel, for setting it out very clearly also.
Yeah, thanks, yeah, for that comment. Truly, for us to think about transformation without being able to be humble and caring is almost like we are thinking about machine and not human. But yeah, and it also reflects in research. It reflects on what we do and what we practice in general. So I had this question as well, just to have a feel. We in one of our initial conversations, it was very highly contested that it's not important to think about decoloniality or conviviality when you think about research, and there was really back and forth about how far that can actually go. Yeah. So I had this, yeah, I think Leon.
Yeah, thank you, Joel. It was a really nice presentation. I must admit, it always makes me feel a bit uncomfortable, these topics, because I'm a Dutch guy, having all the benefits from colonialism, but I agree that it represents a system that we don't want, and that we definitely don't want to sort of propagate. So I think it is good to raise that and to make that explicit. And I do think so. I voted yes on the last statement. I do think that a lot of the principles and the values that you explained as being the principles behind decolonialism and conviviality, that those are the principles and the values that we also want to put central if we talk about the transformation pathways. There is just one thing that I'm also a bit uncomfortable with, apart from my own personal position, and that is that I think these are very important but also sort of delicate topics, and in the abstract, it is sometimes very difficult to do justice to actually their complexity. So I just want to give a bit of a counter push against, not against the community-led, because I think it's important, but against the belief that this is easy, or that community themselves would agree on where they want to go, would not have power differentials, would not have sometimes very severe conflicts. That's one thing. And the other thing is that I noticed on at least one of your slides, what was it? We don't want Western centric, and that I also thought that is maybe also a particular type of Western centric things, because for me the richness of the thoughts all over the world, but definitely also in the West, is more diverse than what we maybe easily sort of recognize as Western, if we think that colonialism was sort of the inevitable outcome of Western thought. I think there have been other interesting Western scientists and philosophers that reason for principles actually very similar to decoloniality and conviviality. And maybe a nice question is, with all this discussion, do we still what are maybe our universal values that we still recognize across the globe? Because I think, at least I think they are still there, and also in conviviality sort of reflected, but maybe also good to be explicit about it and put it up for debate.
Yeah, thanks, Leon, for those reflections. Yeah, I mean, many times when we have this conversation, it always seems as if when you think about Western, then it's from the get-go a bad thing. You know? And I think this is often a problem because it's not the movement towards decoloniality, especially when it comes to philosophical aspects and research, is never about throw it away. Is a self-reflection of, does it really fit your context? And given a very common example within Africa, within Kenya, for example, that there's always a push, and academically, we need to publish in really peer-reviewed, top-notch journals. And the question many people often struggle with is, if I do publish a high-value, high-impact journal article, how is the community in Yala, where we are doing our study, going to get access to this? Would it make sense that then the push is not to publish a high-impact journal article, but rather to come and do an impact communication video that they can actually relate with, and there are lessons in there that really shows this is what we learned and these are the next steps? Which one in that regard would be resourceful for the community that we are actually working with in Yala or in King'ol wetland in Kenya? And it's often that, not that the idea of using video or using a lot of video technology and all this is all often Eurocentric. It's not like that is wrong. It's just that how are we applying it in our own context for enhancing uptake? So a lot of things that are from from Europe or from Western context are very useful. The question often is, how are you using or applying it in the context? And this could also even apply in maybe between Belgium and the Netherlands, that it could be a technology, but how it needs to fit within the Netherlands and Belgium are completely different. So there's always that push for context. And I think that's why main component of this is often context. I agree with you, it's not easy. We started having this conversation in the first get-go, and we are told, well, this is quite theoretical. This is just you guys talking. I don't see anywhere where this is going. And over time, we started realizing it's about creating agency. It's about creating a critical mass to even start writing and challenging these dominant ideas. It's not easy, but a lot of some of the literature actually is coming from Europe about decoloniality, and you're making reference to all these philosophical positions about decoloniality. Where is the space that is active for non-Westerns to actually share? And that is one of the agency spaces that we're trying to push for. Can you write about it? Can you share your experiences? Can you really try and actually practice in some regard? And the push for scholarly activism is actually quite resourceful for many people. We are now trying to, this year, have a session, a summer that focuses on how do you pursue scholarly activism? What does it really mean? And how do you position yourself as a scholar to pursue that kind of idea? I do completely agree that a lot of as I said, a lot of literature, a lot of scholars, a lot of initiatives about decoloniality are also coming from the West. And this means that there are certain principles that are also shared in terms of, priority, context, pluralism, all these contexts are actually also embedded in a lot of the activities from the West. So I wouldn't say it's entirely a Southern issue. It's just that there's inequalities also within the West space. And the question is how we contextualizing to those inequalities. Universal values, yes, I suppose there are things that we still all agree on, whether it's from the South, from the North, from the West. There are principles that we all agree on. It's just that some of these principles have a particular contextual thing. I'll use an example that might not be comfortable to everybody in the room. There is a perspective, for example, of monogamy and polygamy, right? So if you ask a particular culture in a setting, they'll probably say, well, there's nothing wrong ethically. So there's ethics and morals of it. There's nothing wrong with it. But then there's Western religion that then comes and says, well, monogamy is the way to go. So would it mean that we all agree, for example, in many contexts, that marriage might be a good thing, but how we pursue it might be totally different in different regards. So I suppose that we have some universal values that are actually very important, and upholding them is not about Western or Southern or Northern, but these are values that we all embrace in terms of what we do in different settings, but still, I think global values that we need to consider, including humility. Humility has no cultural bounds. The aspect of being able to care, it's a value that we all hold. How we practice it vary, but these are values that we all and cross-culturally are important in different spaces. Yeah.
I'm not sure why I can't see. Hi, I'm not sure why I can't see. I've just lost my where I can put up my hand. I have no idea what has happened. uh, uh, Thank you, Joel, for bringing up this conversation. I know it's a conversation which is gaining a lot of momentum. And I don't think it's something we need to hide from when it is difficult to discuss. But I think it is actually been going on for kind of at a low phase. And I'll give just a bit of example which could actually come into this. It may have the positivity when it comes to especially natural resource management. Because like Joel has said, like the system we are working on, when you look at the issue of land mapping and land ownership, if we don't really get into the base of that, or what we are talking about transformation, we can call it, we can kind of just give up at this point. So how do we need to bring this change? And I think the last time we gave our experience for T-Labs, one of the question was, what are your transformation? And I think this context is bringing in a different way on how, as a project, we need to look at our transformative pathways, and we need to look at our indicators. What are the indicators? Are we just looking at where we go and say policies have been made? For me, no. And I think Joel has put it very clear on what it is, where you just, if you can initiate a situation where you can have community-driven activities, where they accept and they are able to do that, you create realization like we did in our last T-Lab. Like, as I said, when we went in there, some of the communities had taken the county government to court. Everybody was suing everybody on left, right, not. But I think when you bring up this acceptability and you bring up to people to realize that you have multiple pathways in which you can be able to do something, we saw a lot of change, and the communities are actually going to withdraw the cases. For me, if you talk about transformation, that's a very good indicator on a pathway towards fully transformation. So as a project, I think we need to really think about what I know we had put our indicators on transformation, but really, what are the indicators we need to guide us in transformation? Because with this decoloniality and conviviality, however uncomfortable it is subject we have to discuss. And I said, I'll just bring a simple example. Like if you look at the Nile Basin, and you look at it in terms of historical management of the Nile Basin, with the Nile Treaty, and you know what the Nile Treaty was all about. But in the 2020s, I think the countries involved realized you can never be able to manage Nile Basin if you really look at it from that colonial aspect of land ownership. And I think there was a whole change to bring up what we call the Nile Basin Initiative. This was brought up whereby you looked at different pathways. And I think there's a lot coming in Kenya. Coming in Africa. Majority of you have had the big dam in Ethiopia. Look at the way these people have done the damming system. When this dam was being built, there was everybody, we all signed and against the dam because it was going to destroy the Nile Basin. But the people from Ethiopia came and says it is us who has these issues, and they decided to fund to build this dam. So it's a conversation we have to start discussing, especially on transformative pathway. So I know it is not an easy, I think we have been pushing it in a lot of areas, but I can tell you it's globally causing a lot of interest, and people are starting to get more comfortable discussing these issues. We had a big conference last year, which was held in Vienna. And this became a very big debate and a big discussion in this, where we had more than 120 delegates from so many African and European continents. So I think it's something, as a project, we need to look at it. And we look at when we are bringing this transformation, what are really our indicators of the transformation, which we can come and say, this is happening. Because for me, our system we are working it, if these people can work together and be able to look forward to start working up on strategies in terms of management of the Yala wetland, for me, that is a huge indicator of transformation. Also, full capacity can be seen maybe 10 or 5 years to come. And as Joel says, it can be positive or it can be a curse. So I think we need to look at it in both ways. So thank you. Thank you.
So now there is silence, but maybe someone else wants to respond. I like your response, Joel, but also your inputs, Kitaka, especially on thinking about the indicators. I think Wim wants to join.
No, so actually I put in the poll, I'm not sure. And actually I am sure, because if I look at the values and what you are talking about, I mean, I fully agree. But I'm not sure about the terminology. That's a bit my, Kijk, I fully agree with the fact that, I mean, in the past and maybe still, you know, the Western dominance is too large, and we are pushing things. And so I think the fact that countries in the global South for themselves think about, you know, how they want to develop and what kind of approaches and tools they want to use. And I think I fully support. So I think we have to be very modest and we have to listen. So in the first poll, I also mentioned listening. I think that's extremely important. But my confusion is a little bit in the fact that under decolonialism, you put a lot of aspects which is not necessarily all related to the fact that let's say European countries, you know, were quite dominant in the past and maybe still, because I mean it's also about top down. It can also be about a ministry in Kenya, you know, not listening to the people and just pushing their policies, or I mean, if you look at the norm, the values and the principles, I mean, it does not all come from the fact that the Western world or Europe has been very dominant in the past, which I fully realize. And that's a bit where my confusion is. If you look at the different aspects that you presented under the term decolonialism, then I see many aspects. Some of them I also see back in integrated water resource management. Some I see back in other kind of concepts, which are again Western concepts, maybe, I don't know. So that's a bit my confusion. That's why I said I don't know, but I fully support the principles and the values that you presented, Joel. So don't worry.
Yeah, Vim, thanks for the vote of confidence. And I suppose, yeah, this whole concept of decoloniality, and some point when you are looking at it from even from a local context, you know, Kenyan context, for example, there's already these hierarchies, you know. There's a someone who actually challenged me in one of the conversations we have having about it, and he said, well, you keep going from one country to another talking about coloniality, but it's just you who's doing that. I mean, from the people I know, you are already an elite, you know, and therefore you already contribute to this imbalance. At what point do you have room for someone like me? I mean, now this paraphrasing, for someone like me to contribute this kind of agenda. I mean, accept the fact that we've had this conversation, we've collected some of our ideas, and you know, we've really gone into depth of this, but you've gone ahead to share your ideas, you know, in other places. So how are you not reinforcing colonialism in itself? Because one of the aspects is this hierarchy of work, you know, the bridging elitism and opening up space for people who are considered otherwise. So I suppose the concept is that a lot of the ideas are either Western or Eurocentric, but not all of them are. And in some aspects, even a local context has already demonstrated elitism that actually shuts off the other people. This has been seen in, for example, elitist practices like medicine, where only a certain group of people keep on going on and on being in medicine, or certain practices, nursing, law, that is only, or maybe known to be for only certain people, and anyone else getting into that space is seen as going into the wrong space. So disrupting this dominance of ideas, I think, is the anchor of it. Some of them, most being Eurocentric, but not all of them. And even when they are not Eurocentric, there's still a dominant space, there's a hierarchy. We try this concept. I think it's now a lot of people do this. Is that at a conference you don't have badges that says professor or doctor, or they just give you a first, second name, or first and last name. And the moment someone is introduced as professor, very quickly the audience around them just goes lower, and it happens a lot in settings in Africa and a lot of, I want to use the word global south, because there is that hierarchy that automatically comes to play with particular power and privilege. Having gone to school gives you privilege, whether in Europe or not, gives you privilege. So how are you exercising your privilege in the broader scheme? So yeah, I agree with you that it's not necessarily always a Western versus Southern conversation. Sometimes it's a within Southern conversation, and it's becoming more and more important to open up spaces to have these conversations.
Yeah, maybe I totally agree on South
I
people just when
you can change your voice.
Yeah, can you hear me? Yeah, I'm saying when we think of decolonization, sometimes we tend to just think about north-south. But even within the South, there's a lot of it, because when you come to countries like Kenya, you even have what we call bourgeois families. And therefore, how do you make everybody realize, work on together? And I just had, in fact, at the moment, I had a very interesting experience, because I sent a paper to one of the journals, and it's a scientific component, but I brought in an aspect of citizen science. And I think one of the reviewers thought this was absolutely a different way of looking at things rather than what was it done. Because in the beginning, I was like, is this even publishable? Because the question was, I did not do it the normal scientific way, but I did it in the normal, with a major interest on citizen science, as we are saying, whereby we see how to bring in the people, how to utilize the information from the people. And this was through experience of one of the project I had, where we actually had a lot of citizen science, and we realized you can actually do a lot with this kind of information. But the question is, are the journals, scientific journals, ready to listen to this kind of knowledge? So this is what we are talking about. How do we change their transform so that people can see things in a different way? So I've gotten 2 reviews. One of them was absolutely excellent. And one person was like, who is going to use this information? And therefore, this is what we are talking about. So how do we penetrate this system? So, how do we make people realize there are different ways, there are multiple ways of doing things and making them more effectively, and not only north-south, even within south-south, and even within Kenya itself. And that is actually the challenge we are having in our place where we are working, in our wetlands, because this aspect of hierarchy, it is extreme. It's actually one of the highest in the countries. How do we bring this transformation? And that's why I was saying, if we can actually just bring these people together, they start talking together, they start doing things together, in 5 years, I believe the way they are going to manage that system will be very different if this project was not started. Can see Sami.
Thank you. Yeah, I see Sumit has raised his hand. Maybe to respond or to add that. Feel free.
Thank you so much, Joel, for this presentation, and the discussion following that is even more interesting to me. I have a don't necessarily have a reflection on it, but I was just continuously hearing on several nuances, which we were talking in the context of global South, but also what is happening in the global North. A couple of points, not necessarily reflections, but also maybe a devil's advocate to play around with these three very big terms. We have transformation, we have decolonization, and we have conviviality. We talk a lot about conviviality and decolonization in this corridor where I work. For me, the three concepts are very colonial in its own way, coming from a certain type of scientific rigor. And then, of course, we are applying now them in the global South, but also in the global North context. But they are also very exclusionary in nature, you know, they are kind of pushing back on very fundamental aspects of what is happening around disasters, what is happening around development. I know people don't want to talk about development anymore. It's not sexy enough. So it's gone, it's out of the picture. But we are these kind of issues are pushing on the most fundamental aspects of what people are still struggling. I have been reading reports and also seen it this time when I was in the field in the border areas of India and Bangladesh. Much worse in India, I would say. The kind of poverty you see there, I don't think so they're interested in decolonization anymore, or they would think about that as a concept. So for me, maybe we can connect it, yes, because of the colonial background and all sorts of things coming from India. We do see that. But I think, like what Professor Kitaka was saying, we are very much responsible ourselves for what we have created in terms of structure. And we kind of create those exclusionary systems based on this type of knowledge, what we are using. So I'm all up for discussion, deliberation on this, but I would also request for all of us to think a bit more on the side that if we're talking about decolonization, what are we really missing on? I think that is also very important for us to keep in mind. I will stop here, but I think that's the only slight note I would really like to, because we have to be also very careful. Sometimes it's good enough to get into the latest debates, but also not forget of what we had to think of what is really happening on the ground. Thanks, yeah.
Thanks, Sumit, and I see also a thumbs up from Joel. So thanks for your contribution. What I was in relation also to everything that was said, and it's also a term that came by in the presentation of Joel. To me, it's very much also important to the role of capitalist exploitation and how that actually also had supported colonialism very much, and also that idea that the world and the natural resources and human resources are exploitable. And that is, I think, also in science often the case, so that we can exploit the knowledge that we gather as data from our research subjects, and when we publish that in journal papers, and then we can shine maybe it, and then we have exploited that resource for our own capital. Engage. So, and I think if we are also looking at our practices on the ground and also in this project, I think, Joel, you mentioned some of these, or maybe participants already in the word cloud in the beginning, and there also the conviviality comes in. That is indeed that this is about partnerships and how we are doing this together, and for that sake, in terms of sustainable development, also not throwing that term away, is that we are seeking for that we want to contribute to flourishing communities, societies, and that there is our awareness that it's only optional, I think, that this has been done together without exploitation, in order for it to be sustainable. Also in that term from the scholars that studied capitalism in the beginning, that if the exploitation takes too long, you get revolution from it. So in order for sustainable development, everybody needs to be involved. And that can be done indeed from that perspective of empathy, friendliness, that conviviality has in it. And that is then also interesting. So in relation to what we are doing in this project itself, how are we dealing with each other in the project with respect and sharing and co-developments, or but also how are we practicing as a project team in the different nodes in the field and reporting back, and also to our communities with whom we are working. And therefore, I think also, Joel, what you say, it is, if we want to extend that knowledge into the local communities, into the field, then it doesn't make sense for them that we are publishing papers in international scientific journals. Yet at the same time, if we want to give credit also to that, so some sort of international credit to that knowledge, like with the citizens-based science, it is sometimes also important to put that into those international journals, to create that kind of credibility in it. So there's all kinds of challenges in how to do this transformative research on transformations. Are there some more ads from participants?
And maybe that's why I was saying, as a project, we need to relook on what we said in terms of indicators and outputs. I know we have a lot of outputs. We talked about publications, we talked about this, but we need to think about simple guidelines. In most of the projects which we participate in, we come up with simple guidelines which can be left behind for the communities in terms of what to do, how to do it. And I think that's why I'm saying we need to reflect back and look at, what did we say our indicators for transformation is? What did we say our output should be like? Are we really bringing up that community aspect within our outputs, or are we only focusing on these top journal publications, PhD and thesis? What are we leaving behind? Because that is what it counts in terms of this transformation.
Joel, you have raised your hand.
Yeah, thanks. I think the conversation and the reflection on how it integrates in the project is very resourceful. And I just want to say that in my own opinion, the question of self-reflexivity is very important. It's important to check yourself, I would say, yourself, what you're contributing. Is it in any way accelerating the inequalities or accelerating the colonial perspective or historical legacies? And how is it that in you as a person doing some of this work, how are you contributing to the positive side, opening up spaces for other people, having the plurality perspective of solutions and approaches? But in its own sense, of course, even with the self-reflexivity, I would say we need to think about it from the outputs. Are we decolonial and convivial in the outputs? In the process, are we including people? Are we being deliberate in the resources and how we are allocating it? And importantly, in the outcomes you want to achieve. So reflecting in the outputs, the outcomes, the resources allocation and the process of it is very resourceful to see how we're contributing to either not reinforcing the inequalities and inequities, and also promoting the positiveness of the colonial perspective and the transformational that is process that is also convivial. Thanks, and back to you.
Yeah, thank you, Joel. maybe I'm going to say those were very nice last words, and also a take-home message for everybody who was now joining with us online, and who will rewatch maybe also this webinar online later. Thank you very much, Joel, for this very interesting conversation and dialogue that you triggered in us. And I hope we can, in that spirit that you shared with us, continue also our cooperation in the project. So thank you very much. Very inspiring.
Thank you for giving the audience.
And then I'm going to just share that on in a month from now, on 18 March, we have Charlene, who is also today here with us. And she is going to share with us her experience and knowledge around the use of the Delphi approach for co-designing normative adaptation pathways. So a very, well, maybe not very different, but a very different topic, but very much fitting in our ambitions of our program. Thank you very much, everybody, for joining in this webinar. Again, Joel, thank you very much for your inspiring presentation. Thank you, everybody, for your interesting questions and commands. And with that, I close the webinar, but I do see that Nzula Tika has raised her hand.
I think for me, I just wanted us to clarify time so that we don't have this back and forth. So the webinar will be at 2 p.m. or will it be at 3 p.m.? Next webinar on 18th.
That's a very good question. Yes, thank you very much. I wanted to keep it open and just mention 18 March. I think in the next project meeting, a final decision will be made on this. So we leave it to the